G'day champions, how the flippin' heck are ya? Here we've got a mainboard out of a DSL2000 head, 100 watt. It's the UK made one. You might remember a few weeks ago we had one on the bench and I confirmed that it didn't have the thermal runaway issue with the board, the bias drift. I let the customer know this. He was interested in getting a new board anyway because he's heard that it can become a problem further down the road, even though it may not be a problem right now. So we ordered a new board. Generally that problem doesn't occur on the boards that, in my experience anyway, that have this darker sort of semi-translucent fiberglass board, whereas I've found it is almost universally occurs to the lighter fiberglass look, the sort of opaque light ones. This one has been confirmed to have the issue, and I keep it hanging around just to demonstrate. I can attach the meter probes to it, give it a little bit of heat and show the resistance dropping between the control grid and the high voltage areas and even the heater area pretty significantly. So that was replaced on a TSL combo. The combos are the worst for it because they're upside down and the heat goes up and accelerates the degradation of the board. So anyway, the customer opted to go for a new board anyway, considering it's $400 dues and you basically end up with a new amp. You got all new caps, new everything, new sockets. The old valves are buggered anyway, so we're putting a new set of them in. And we're going to pop this board in for his peace of mind. So I ordered this board from the States. It worked out cheaper to buy it from a retail outlet that I've got a trade account with than it was to buy it from the local distributor. It's almost like they don't want me to have them. Got shipped over, took about 3-4 weeks, and it just arrived. I just unwrapped it. It was in a larger cardboard box with paper wadding, and it was wrapped in bubble wrap. Now, what's the first thing you notice? What do you notice? Got some caps floating around there, almost about to fall out, sitting on an angle. Got some caps over here, bent over. Resistors bent over, and I think various cracked solder joints. So let's have a very close look at this. It's not just a matter of dropping and running. It's going to need to be gone over and possibly some repair on a brand new board. Joy. So Lyle over at Psionic Audio did a similar video to this. I think it was entitled "Why is Grumpy Tech So Damn Grumpy?" or something to that effect, where he goes over it and shows all the solder problems and just ways to neaten it up and make it more reliable. So this is pretty much that, but of course with an Australian accent. So this board was reasonably well packed, but all it takes is a little bit of pressure on those big top. Yeah, it just fell out. That's cool, isn't it? So that glue does nothing. It just falls off, doesn't stick to the board, doesn't stick to the caps. Hot snot doesn't do anything. I'm not that type anyway. This one's about the same. It's a little bit firmer. I don't want to damage the pads, but being through hole plated, the pads generally live to fight another day. These are snap-in caps, but their connections are cracked as well. Hard to make out there, but I can see the pins moving, and the solder pad is not. So the main issue here is that on the smaller caps is that they haven't been pushed down against the board when they were soldered. So you can see the leads are straight. They were just shoved in and wave soldered. So I think they were relying on the hot snot to hold them in there during the reflow or wave soldering process, if it was wave soldered. I'm assuming it was wave soldered. So they should have at least bent the leads over a little, but I guess that's not in their budget. We've got some mashed over resistors here too, kind of hard to see from that point of view, but if I zoom out a little, yeah, so they're bent over and they're at risk of touching other stuff as well, so they should just straighten up okay. It's just a matter of bending the leads back. But solder connection wise, we want to go over the whole lot and double check everything. Now, there's been some rework already on a brand new board because there's flux there and nowhere else on the board. So at some point the flux was cleaned off the entire board surface, after reflow or after wave soldering, and then at some point someone's gone through and touched up some solder joints. So they touched up them, and this stuff over here where the caps are pulled out, that's occurred during transit. To be honest, for a $400 board, you'd like to see them do a little bit of effort in the packing. I think it's a matter of they're making these things begrudgingly because they wish they didn't have the problem in the first place, and I do sympathise with them there, but you're a multi-million-dollar company. Once you've made the mistake, you own it. So pack them properly, put them in a little box, make some little inserts out of foam or something that have a slot in them, and space it away from the faces of the box or something, you know. Don't just ship it and pray for the best, or drop the price because your techs are going to have to repair them when they arrive. So another issue on the factory boards is the bridge rectifier for the DC heaters. It's actually run pretty hard. You can see the discoloration on the tracks there, on the traces. Now that is mounted hard against the board, and see that screw hole there? Well, that's because it's meant to be mounted to a heatsink. I know, shock horror, right? Who uses a bridge rectifier with a heatsink like it's on the data sheet? No one. So they just run the things hot as hell, and they do have the opportunity to melt their own solder connections. So what we'll do with this one on the new board is we'll mount another one. I'll pull one out of the drawer, donate it to the cause, and we'll elevate it off the board a little and put some spacers on there, or crimp the leads so it sits up above the board, so at least you've got a little bit of airflow around the thing. I mean, it's right next to a cap as well, which isn't ideal, so we want the thing to have as much airflow as possible and just provide a little bit of isolation from the unit itself and through its leads, conducting that heat back to the board. Right, so we've got the boffer up and running, as we do. Some new solder on there. This is the bridge rectifier. Right, so there's our little BR, what is it, 6? BR6, so that's 6 amp bridge rec. And that's our BR10, that's a 10 amp. So this is all I got in stock. That'll work. We've just got to bend the leads in a little, and we're crimping them anyway, so they've got some play in them. So that will have a little bit more surface area. We'll mount it up off the board, and she'll do the job as long as it fits in the footprint. So that fits okay there. We've biased it off towards the right a little bit to keep it away from this cap, which we removed to get rid of the glue crap under it anyway. So now it's got a little bit of airflow and a little bit more room, a little bit more length on the leads to dissipate the heat a bit before it all makes it to the circuit board. So I neglected to mention earlier that everywhere that we're reworking, that's hard to say after a few whiskeys, we're going to remove all the solder and replace it with lead-free solder, because you can't really mix the two. The alloys don't work together and you end up with a brittle, dry joint. So everywhere that we're removing it, we remove all of it before we apply some new leaded stuff. Just come out with that glue that does nothing. Yep. Sweet. Now what we'll do when we put these back in, we'll silicone between them. So silicone actually does stick like shit to a blanket. It's got a tiny bit of give, so it doesn't just fracture, but it dampens everything. It's like a shock absorber. I'm not going to use it on the base to the solder, to the circuit board, sorry, but I'm going to use them to each other. So now they become like one big part. So now it's not only the leverage between those, like 12 mil apart from those pins, it's the combined distance from the overall of the outer pins. So it gives you better leverage, better mechanical support on the board. So when I solder them in, I just get them good coverage. both pins. I'm going to stand it up so I can access the other side of the cap. Just put some gentle downward pressure on it and just make sure that they're all the way in. Can't really do that when it's standing up. Just make sure they're seated hard against the board, like that. See, that's already way more sturdy. All you got to do is just hold the thing down all the way, and you're heaps better than factory condition. The snap pins are supposed to hold them in place during the wave soldering, but you know, all it takes is a little bit of shock and they come loose. They're not really a mechanical connection, they just stop the thing from completely falling out a little bit. I would personally like to see 105 degree rated caps in any valve amp, let alone a UK made Marshall, made in England. Now I'll switch over to the smaller tip for the components with fly leads as opposed to the ones with the snap-on. There's a little combination screwdriver and tweezers for the tips from Pace. With little grippy bits on the inside that do nothing. Just remove that loose cap completely. And clean up the solder on both of them before reinserting them. You can see these weren't really made with rework in mind either, because there's no thermal relief around the pads here. So you can see there, that's just a opening in the solder mask. It doesn't actually have a pad with a little moat around it like you get on some better quality boards. That is so when you are heating it up, you don't have to heat the hell out of it, because you don't have that big landing area there, the big ground plane sucking the heat out of the soldering iron, because they work like heat sinks. With these, they're designed just for the wave soldering process, where it's already preheated, so it's no concern of theirs some dickhead in his garage coming along and desoldering these later. So there's plenty of length on those leads. We can put a little bend in them just to give them a bit more support and just hold them in place while we put the other one in. Just like that. It just holds them there. So you can see there, just putting them hard against the board gives them so much more stability. And then we'll put some silicone in there like we were with these ones, and that'll help even more for the future. Oddly enough, these Nichicons here are bottomed out against the board, so they look okay. I'll have a look with the loop and just make sure that it's spot on. That's a nice little factory solder connection there, isn't it? So you got to go over everything, man. Brand new board, you got to inspect it as if it's 40 years old. So the main reason for the shitty solder connections is, do you see a crimp there? They've got one, but it's tiny and it goes through the hole, so it defeats the purpose. So I've got to probably remove all these resistors that are standing up, crimp the leads properly so they don't actually sink down into the board, and give them some kind of that being the mechanical support for the solder joint, whereas they've made a token effort but not adequate. Besides, the resistors are pointing the wrong freaking way. Doesn't matter at all unless you've got OCD, and got a little bit of it. So you can see there the tiny little crimps. They're not much bigger than the actual solder pad hole. So we'll straighten them out. Use the smooth smooth section of the needle nose pliers and use my crimpers. It's a lot more significant. That will hold them in at that height and no lower. See, that's better. They're not going anywhere now. So you might remember this one with its cooked KT77s, and it's pretty rusty chassis. So we'll move them out. I'll start disconnecting things for the changeover. Now here's the guts of the unit, just to refresh your memory and mine. The easiest way to get these things out is literally drop it down from underneath, since the board is pretty buried down in there. When we've got it out, we'll use that new angle of vision from underneath to look at the bottom of these boards, inspect them, probably do some mods for better high current around the speaker area. They've got a, I believe this is the one with the factory fault where it defaults on the normaling jack to carry the current through to the speaker, which is not great because that's a pretty weak spot. So all the modifications have been done to the board. I won't put silicon on it yet because it'll end up everywhere. I want to get this board installed today, and we can put some silicon on once we've done any testing, and you can access the areas where we want to apply the silicon after the installation of the board. Just primarily want to get it in there, get it tested, and then let the silicon cure overnight and be ready for pickup tomorrow. So it's pretty tempting to start pulling cables out. The service schematics are okay, but I don't think they go into details on every single connector. So just get a notepad and write what goes where, what's at one end of the board and what's at the other end of the board, and you should be right. And just take a lot of photos too, out wide as well as zoomed in. But also, by the same token, if this has been fucked with before, don't take all the connections as gospel anyway. You should be just checking as well that everything's plugged in how it should be, instead of just blindly following. Someone else might have had a go and stuffed it up, so you always got to be wary of that too. Alright, so we've created a map of the connections on the, well, all of the connections go to the main board, and that's kind of good to do. I had one from a previous one somewhere, but I couldn't find it. It's a good thing to have in case one ever comes to you in a state of disarray, all in pieces. Well, now you can figure out what goes where, and that's information that's not necessarily on the schematic. So, alright, so now we can remove the little cover here which covers the main board, and we'll have to remove the screws going to the output valve sockets as well, and the smaller Phillips for the screws fixing to the chassis. Might help if we remove all the preamp valves first too. They're probably still fine. We'll test them out. Alrighty, so we dropped the board out. Let's have a look at some carnage, eh? We could only see this side before when we did the previous video. It was down hidden under everything, so we'll have a closer look. Alright, so here's our exploded resistors. I go over in the previous video what the fault mode was and what caused it. At least what I believe caused it. A collateral damage of a cap down there in the bias supply. But yeah, go over the last video. I'll link it in the description below, and you'll be able to go through the logic behind figuring out what happened to this one. But yeah, you can see it probably was repairable. Those resistors there, what I often find is the boards look really bad, but then when you remove the component, check that the traces are okay, and you clean up the area, it almost goes back to new, right? But on the other side, you can see the resistors had started melting their own solder connections, and it looks like there might be a little bit of, it's gotten too hot, and you can see there's a bit of a bloom there in the fiberglass underneath, so it looks like that might have done some permanent damage to the board. So the owner was probably good in his instinct to replace this board. So you can see here the discoloration I was talking about around the bridge rectifier there. And those soldered joints are starting to crack too. It's funny that they've trimmed 2 out of 4 leads. and those two are untouched. Strange. So it might be a bit hard to make out there, but that's pin 5, the control grid, and that's got a crack right across there. So that valve possibly lost bias. Every pin's cracked, particularly on that valve. The others look a bit better. But what happens, a valve loses its bias supply via the control grid, and it heats up, and then the whole thing just goes nuclear, and because it's expanding so rapidly and getting so hot, it'll often crack the rest of the pins on that particular valve. So some stuff that we do have to transfer from the old board to the new one, we've got to put new fuses on here. We'll check the fuses on the existing one. That's the heater fuses. And we'll change these little plastic standoffs from this board to that board, because the new one doesn't come with it for $400. One other difference between the two revisions here, this is revision 10, the old board, and this is revision 20, the new one. The old one had opto couplers, opto couplers for channel switching, whereas the new one, they've changed the layout and put a footprint for it and used relays instead. There are a few other minor changes, just layout stuff mainly. That connector there, connector 4, is pointing that way. That one's 90 degrees to it. There was a few other components on the old board where it was called a resistor and it was a capacitor, and like you look at the schematic and it was a capacitor symbol and it had like R53 or something there. So I don't know. Again, don't lose sleep over it. It is what it is. They are compatible. And the old one was 8 tested by Joe T. I wonder what it tasted like. So you've got to be a little bit careful taking these plastic standoffs out, because there's not a lot of plastic there on the other side of the board. Oop. Here's me slipping with the thing. It's hard to do stuff on camera. I didn't mangle it too bad. Just do that 10 or so times. Gotcha. So that's a naked board. We'll just put it over there, hanging on the wall of shame. I'll just mount these pins back in the new board here. You just press in that way because they've got a bevel on them. And there they all are, and we're ready to mount it to the little panel there and stick it back in the box. 5-year-old jokes again. Well, that's more like a 15-year-old joke. Anyway, so I thought I'll just inspect the bias board before we put it in, because it's a pretty critical component. And you got dry solder joints there on the trim pot too, so we'll reflow them, and there's some crack joints on the other one. So yeah, not great. So I'm just reflowing these connections. I've given it some fresh solder. This is pre-lead free. So the old board's leaded solder, the new one's lead free. So just listen. You know, a little tick when I heated it up. That's because I'm putting pressure on the bottom, and that trim pot wasn't seated against the board properly. So when I've melted the solder, it's popped down against the board. That's why you get cracked solder joints, because solder joints are like little anchors on the inside of the hole. Little anchors. I don't know why I'm doing a prairie dog impersonation, but anyway, little anchors that hold on to the bottom side of the pads, because they're sort of, anchor shaped, I guess. And if they get pulled this way, the anchor sort of does its thing. The pin can still pull out, but at least it gives some resistance. Whereas if the component's up in the air with nothing on this side and it's able to be pushed down by, a screwdriver, you can crack the solder joints. And this is, I'd have to have a look at the circuit, see if when that connection fails, whether it just goes to the most negative supply, so safe, or if it cuts off the bias supply completely, so extremely unsafe. For the output valves anyway, you'll be alright. Your wallet won't be. Put a little bias connector back in its house, or as they say in Canada, back in its house. Put your moose back in the house. Hey? Well, I was just about to install this new board and noticed a dry solder joint on pin 5 of V5 as well, just like on the old one. At least they're consistent. So now I'm paranoid, so I'm going to clean off all that lead-free solder and put new solder there. Just get rid of it all and reflow, well, re-solder every output valve joint at least. The preamp ones look a little bit nicer, but yeah, it's a bit of a shame that you got to go over it in this much detail. Alright, they're all reflowed. We'll clean that flux off and we'll continue with the reinstallation, shall we?